Africa is not preparing for the future. Africa is preparing to rewrite it. Across the continent, far from Western headlines, something enormous has been quietly forming. A strategy so bold, so economically explosive, and so geopolitically disruptive that it has left policymakers in Washington, Paris, London, and Brussels scrambling to understand what is coming. They call it Africa's $900 billion secret wealth plan. But it did not begin as a single plan. It began as a whisper, a shift, a quiet realization among African leaders, institutions, billionaires, technologists, and governments that the continent could no longer afford to operate in the world on anyone else's terms. For decades, Africa's role in the global economy was defined by extraction: gold, oil, diamonds, cobalt, lithium, copper, cocoa, immense wealth leaving the continent, while crumbs returned. But the 2020s lit a fire, and by the mid-2030s, a new Africa had stepped into formation. An Africa that wanted control, an Africa that wanted power, an Africa that wanted ownership. The $900 billion plan is bigger than money. It is a shift in global power. It is a declaration that the continent is entering a new era of wealth creation, not from exporting raw materials, but from refining, manufacturing, processing, digitizing, and monetizing the resources the world cannot live without. The story begins with a question African economists have been asking for years. Why is a continent that holds the world's most valuable minerals still the poorest? Why is Africa a $30 trillion resource powerhouse that only earns a fraction of its real value? Why does the world depend on African materials, but not African leadership? The answer: dependency was never accidental. But the new Africa? It refuses to play by old rules. As global tensions rise, Western economies now find themselves watching a new African strategy unfold, one that could shift the balance of power in industry after industry. From energy to digital finance to critical minerals, Africa has silently moved from being a commodity supplier to becoming a value creator. This $900 billion plan is built on 5 powerful pillars, and each one threatens the global status quo. The first pillar is mineral sovereignty. African governments finally realized that the world's green revolution, the electric cars, the renewable energy systems, the batteries, the chips, depends on Africa. Without African cobalt, lithium, copper, graphite, manganese, and rare earth elements, there is no green transition. That realization was a turning point. In the early 2020s, countries like the DRC, Namibia, Zambia, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe began enforcing a radical rule: no more exporting raw minerals. If Western companies want Africa's minerals, they must build factories, processing plants, refineries, and value chains on African soil. This changed everything. Zambia and DRC launched a joint industrial strategy to refine battery materials locally. Tanzania blocked unprocessed lithium exports. Zimbabwe banned raw lithium shipments entirely. Namibia took control of its uranium industry. It was a new declaration: Africa will no longer export poverty and import wealth. By forcing global corporations to invest in African soil, the continent began capturing billions in lost value. Refineries were built. Battery plants were announced. Tech companies started relocating production lines. What the West fears is simple: Africa is no longer handing over trillion-dollar minerals for pennies. The second pillar is energy independence. Africa realized that its energy poverty was engineered. For centuries, the continent with the highest solar potential on Earth remained the least electrified. But a new coalition of African governments quietly launched a $200 billion mega initiative, an energy corridor stretching from North Africa's solar belt to West Africa's gas reserves, from East Africa's geothermal fields to Southern Africa's hydro giants. This was not about charity. It was about power, literally. A powered Africa is a wealthy Africa. And with energy comes manufacturing, data centers, AI infrastructure, robotics, smart cities, industrial clusters, and modern hospitals. New solar grids in the Sahara. Gigantic hydro systems expanding in the Congo Basin. Geothermal expansion in Kenya and Ethiopia. Gas monetization in Nigeria, Senegal, Mozambique. Hydrogen projects rising across Namibia and Morocco. These projects, combined, create an energy network projected to generate hundreds of billions in yearly industrial output. The West fears this because energy independence means Africa no longer relies on Western banks, NGOs, or outdated systems to survive. It means Africa becomes a global manufacturing frontier, not just a resource pit. The third pillar is financial sovereignty. Africa has long been controlled by Western financial systems that dictated currency value, loans, and trade. But something extraordinary is happening. African economists, fintech innovators, and central banks are quietly building their own frameworks. A Pan-African payment and settlement system is already real. Countries can trade in local currencies, bypassing the US dollar. Several African states are pushing for regional stablecoins backed by real assets. The African Continental Free Trade Area is building the world's largest single market initiative, connecting 1.4 billion people. Africa's billion-dollar fintech sector, led by Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, Rwanda, Ghana, and South Africa, is disrupting the future of money. Mobile payments, digital banking, blockchain clearing, cross-border transaction frameworks. The West understands one thing clearly. A financially unified Africa would be one of the most powerful economic blocs on Earth, and it would be beyond Western control. The fourth pillar is agricultural dominance. Africa holds 60% of all the remaining fertile land on the planet. Global food demand is projected to skyrocket by 2050, and suddenly, the world's breadbasket is Africa, not America, not Europe, not China. African countries have started banning raw agricultural exports. They want processing plants, packaging industries, food tech facilities, and global supply chain hubs built on African soil. African agritech startups are attracting huge investment. Irrigation systems, AI-driven farming, drone agriculture, and large-scale food processing zones are emerging. This could transform Africa into a $1 trillion global food superpower. Western nations understand the consequence. Whoever controls global food systems controls global power. Africa rising in agriculture means Africa rising in influence. The fifth pillar is technological acceleration. For the first time in modern history, Africa is not falling behind in technology. It is leapfrogging. With a young population, high mobile penetration, AI adoption, blockchain innovation, robotics labs, drone delivery systems, and digital literacy booms, Africa is shaping futuristic markets. Tech giants are opening AI centers in Africa. African engineers are designing globally competitive solutions. Startups are solving problems the rest of the world cannot. Smart cities are emerging in Kenya, Rwanda, Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa. AI-powered healthcare, drone-powered logistics, blockchain-based education records, digital identification systems, electric mobility networks, satellite-supported internet systems. This is not a continent catching up. It is a continent reimagining the rules. The $900 billion plan brings all these pillars together, not as separate initiatives, but as one cohesive strategy, a continental reset, a wealth reclamation shift. And for the first time, global power structures are being threatened in a way they did not anticipate. Western fears are not because Africa is rising. They expected that. Western fears come from the speed, the unity, the coordination, and the boldness of Africa's economic offensive. Because if Africa continues this trajectory, global energy will run through Africa. Global food systems will run through Africa. Global digital finance will run through Africa. Global EVs, batteries, chips, and renewable systems will depend on African resources refined in African factories. And with youth populations rising while Western populations age, Africa is becoming not only an economic power, but a demographic one. That is why Western governments quietly hold emergency economic meetings about Africa. Why think tanks release confidential memos warning about African autonomy? Why corporations lobby more aggressively? Why geopolitical analysts warn that Africa's industrial rise will reshape global power? Africa is no longer reacting to the world. Africa is directing the future. But here is the truth. The $900 billion plan is not a secret to Africans. It is only a secret to those who refuse to believe Africa could change. What the West fears is not the plan itself. It is the idea of an Africa that thinks for itself, acts for itself, and wins for itself. This is the new reality. A rising continent, a reawakening, a rebirth of ambition. Africa is not asking for permission. Africa is taking its place, and the world will have no choice but to adjust.